Hello, this is the Sunday sermon for St Christopher's Church in Leicester for Sunday the 7th of March 2021. Our Bible passages for today are Exodus chapter 20 verses 1 to 17 and John chapter 2 verses 13 to 22. So if you've not yet read those passages, please pause this video and then press play. And actually beneath this video you should be able to find two links which you can click on where you can find both of those passages. Today, I want us to think about Jesus in two ways, as our deliverer and also as our destiny. What do I mean by that? Well, firstly, let's think about Jesus as our deliverer. Let's look at our first passage, Exodus chapter 20, the famous passage which features the 10 commandments that God spoke to Israel at Mount Sinai. At the beginning of that passage, God says, "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery." And then he states the 10 commandments in following. These were a summary of how Israel was to obey God, of how they were to obey in living out the life he wanted for them in the desert and beyond that in the promised land. And there is much, of course, we could say about these 10 commandments. But I want to draw your attention to two statements here that relate to the blessings that that Israel could receive if they obeyed. First of all, in Exodus 20 verse 4, God commands Israel not to make idols, to not create false gods based on the things they see around them in creation, and not to bow down to them. And after he states this, he says in verse 4, "For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the fathers to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments." Here is good news for those Israelites who would obey God from their hearts. To them, God declares that he will bless their family from generation to generation into the distant future. And don't we just see so clearly Jesus' desire to love God and keep his commandments in John chapter 2? In fact, in Jesus, we see the only human example of someone with a fully hearted desire to love God and keep his commandments. All other human beings failed. But Jesus does not. Now, maybe you're surprised at the commotion Jesus causes in John chapter 2 by driving out all of the animal sellers and the moneylenders. But Jesus did it out of a heartfelt desire for God's glory and for the blessing of others. You see, the temple was meant to be a house of prayer. And part of the temple court was even for Gentile non-Jews to pray to God. But the hustle and bustle of people selling live animals and changing money presumably made it a noisy, busy place, not really a place of prayer. And this really bothered Jesus. It really, really bothered him. And so he did what he did. We can see here Jesus' zeal for God's house, for God's glory, and for the good of others. Jesus is the ultimate worshipper. He does indeed love God and obey him, even if sometimes it causes a scene. We need to take note here, because sometimes loving and obeying God might mean we have to make a scene sometimes. And then move forward to look at verse 12. It says here, "Honor your father and your mother, so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you." In the Old Testament, God laid out for the people of Israel curses for disobedience and blessings for obedience. And we see promised blessing for obedience here in verse 12. But we also see it throughout the many chapters of the Old Testament, which include many other God-given laws. Now, Jesus was, of course, a son of Israel. He was a Jew who was born under the law. The expectation of obeying God's law in the Ten Commandments and the many other laws was upon him. And Jesus, we are told, lived the perfect life. So he did obey them perfectly. In fact, he was the only human being who ever did obey them perfectly. And he obeyed not just outwardly, but from his heart and soul completely. And yet, when we think of those two verses we've looked at, and how they describe blessings for the one who obeys, do we see it come about in Jesus' earthly life? That is, do we see those blessings come about in his life? Well, the first speaks of 1,000 generations being blessed, and the second speaks of living long in the land God was giving to Israel. Jesus is the ultimate Israelite who perfectly obeys the law. But we don't see 1,000 generations of his physical descendants being blessed. After all, Jesus didn't even marry or have any children. And we don't see him living long in the land. It's estimated that Jesus was killed in his early 30s. And when he was killed, it was brutal. When Jesus says, "Destroy this temple," in John 2 verse 19, he is talking about himself, outlining that he will die. Instead, in Jesus, we see the ultimate, obedient, God-glorifying Israelite not receiving the blessing of obedience, but actually receiving the punishment of disobedience. We see this in what happened to Jesus when he was arrested, tortured, and hung on a cross. This is in line with the law's punishments, not the law's blessings. How is this the case? Well, because of course, Jesus does the great divine exchange on our behalf. Jesus takes the disobedience of lawbreakers like you and like me on himself, and on the cross receives the punishment so that we can receive the blessings that come from his obedience. The blessings that Jesus should have received on account of his perfect obedience. This is the gospel. This is good news. The law held out blessings for obedience and punishment and curses for disobedience. But left to ourselves, we cannot obey. But Jesus can, and he does so on our behalf. But maybe you're thinking, well, will Jesus ever receive the blessings for his perfect obedience, now that he has come through the cross and he lives forever? Well, I think the answer is yes. Because through his obedience and sacrificial death, Jesus gained an enormous family. A family who are eternally blessed, even beyond the length of time of 1,000 generations. This family blessing lasts into all eternity. And that family is me and it is you, if we are trusting in him today. Through faith in Jesus, we become part of God's family. We become Jesus' brothers and sisters. And Jesus will indeed get to live long in the land, and us with him, if we are trusting in him today. And I'm not talking about the kind of mini model version of the land that was the Old Testament land of Israel, but the massively expanded version, which is the new heavens and new earth that God will bring about. Secondly, we see that Jesus is our destiny. As we've seen, Jesus says, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days," in John chapter 2. So, how is Jesus a temple? Well, in the birth of Jesus Christ, in his coming into the world, God, the eternal Son, adds a human nature to himself. He becomes human. Think about an author who writes a story. This author is creating a story which features a world they have created from their imagination, with characters and situations to go into that world. And then at one point, the author decides that they are going to write themselves into the story. And so, suddenly, there appears a character who has the same name as the author, acts just like the author, has the same personality as the author, and tells the other characters in the story that they are the author. That character is an extension of the author. The author has put themselves into the story, into the book. That's like what it means for God to become a man. Jesus is God made flesh, God writing himself into the story. Now, the idea of what a temple is in the Bible is that it's the place where God meets human beings, the place where he dwells among them. And so in Jesus Christ, who is himself both fully God and fully human being, we have a living temple. He is the place where God and humanity meet. But there's another way in which Jesus is the temple of God. Because Jesus is also the ultimate Holy Spirit-filled human being. At Jesus' baptism, the Spirit descended upon him as a dove and remained on him. Jesus is filled with God the Holy Spirit as Jesus as a human being is filled with God the Holy Spirit. So in that way too, Jesus is the temple of God, the place where God dwells. So why does that make Jesus our destiny? Well, because as Christians, if we have connected ourselves to Jesus through faith in him, we also become the temple of God when the Holy Spirit comes to live in us. We are not God made flesh, like Jesus is, but Christians are given the same Holy Spirit that lived in Jesus. As Christians, we don't have physical stone temples anymore. We don't have special holy buildings made from bricks and mortar. Of course, we do have buildings, but simply because they're convenient and useful to us for gathering together in worship and doing ministry. The early Christians had no specialized buildings at all. They met in houses. Instead, if we are followers of Jesus, then we ourselves have become God's temple through our connection to him, who was and is the temple who was destroyed and raised up in 3 days for our salvation. I wonder how you feel about all this. I wonder how you feel all this should affect your experience as a Christian. Well, I would encourage us to bask in the wonder of it all. God has reached out to us. Yes, so we can be reconciled to him. Yes, so we can be forgiven. Yes, so we can obey him. As the Ten Commandments made clear for Israel back in the Old Testament, and as he has also made clear for us who are under the new covenant today. And yes, so that we can worship him. He has reached out to us. And so we can give him the glory he deserves. But also, he has reached out to us so we can be filled with his presence and transformed to be like Jesus for all eternity. Based on the foundation of Jesus, the temple of God, we are built into a temple of God also. As the Apostle Paul says in Ephesians 2:22, in him you too are being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives by his Spirit. And because of God dwelling in us, we can truly love God and obey his commands like Jesus did. So let's seek a greater experience of that from God today.